HPV vaccine. In 2009 and 2012, the Gates Foundation funded tests of experimental HPV vaccines developed by Gates's partners GSK and Merck on 23,000 girls 11 to 14 years old in remote provinces of India. These experiments were part of Gates's effort to bolster those companies' sketchy claims that HPV vaccines protect women against cervical cancer that might develop in old age. Gates and his foundation have large investments in both companies. Since deaths from cervical cancer occur on average at age 58 in the United States and affect only 1 in 40,000 women, and since virtually all these deaths are preventable with early detection by pap smears, any vaccine given to young girls to prevent the low risk of preventable death half a century from now ought to be 100% safe, and this vaccine isn't even close. Both Merck and Glaxo disclosed in their shareholders' reports that profitable performances by their flagship HPV vaccines were top indicators of shareholder value. Gardasil has been a top seller for Merck, earning total global sales of $1.2 billion in 2011, a windfall for the company floundering to recover from a $7 billion court settlement related to criminal charges that the company had knowingly killed between 100,000 and 500,000 Americans by defrauding customers about the safety of its blockbuster pain pill Vioxx. Merck's executives nicknamed the HPV vaccine Help Pay for Vioxx and fast-tracked it to market after shoddy safety tests under pressure from Wall Street analysts itching to downgrade Merck's buy recommendations. At least 1,200 of the girls in Gates's study, 1 in 20, suffered severe side effects, including autoimmune and fertility disorders. 7 died, about 10 times the U.S. death rates for cervical cancer, which almost never kills the young. India's Federal Ministry of Health suspended the trials and appointed an expert parliamentary committee to investigate the scandal. Indian government investigators found that Gates-funded researchers at PATH committed pervasive ethical violations, pressuring vulnerable village girls into the trial, bullying illiterate parents, and forging consent forms. Gates provided health insurance for his PATH staff, but not to any participants in the trials, and refused medical care to the hundreds of injured girls. The PATH researchers targeted girls at ashram pathshalas, boarding schools for tribal children, to dodge the need to seek parental consent for the shots. They gave the girls HPV immunization cards that were printed in English, which the girls couldn't read. They did not tell the girls that they were part of a clinical trial, and instead hoodwinked them with the lie that these were wellness shots that would guarantee lifelong protection against cancer. That was not true. PATH conducted the trials in impoverished rural areas that lacked mechanisms for tracking the adverse effects and had no system for recording major adverse reactions to the vaccines, something legally mandated for large-scale clinical trials. In 2010, the Indian Council of Medical Ethics found that the Gates Group had violated India's ethical protocols. In August 2013, a special parliamentary committee excoriated PATH, stating that the NGO's sole aim has been to promote the commercial interests of HPV vaccine manufacturers who would have reaped windfall profits had PATH been successful in getting the HPV vaccine included in the UIP, Universal Immunization Program of the country. According to Dr. Colin Gonsalves, Senior Counsel of the Supreme Court of India, the Indian Parliament formed a committee, and it was to be a rather surprising move because you generally don't often have such a high-level inquiry into matters affecting poor people, and that was such an extraordinary report. I don't think the Indian Parliament has ever come out with such a scathing report. And the government officials came out and said, we shouldn't have authorized this, we're sorry, and we're not going to allow them again, and now they are back, doing their same old tricks again. In 2013, 2 separate groups of health activists and human rights advocates filed public interest litigation, PIL, petitions calling on India's Supreme Court to investigate the HPV trials and determine whether PATH and other stakeholders responsible for the trial should be held liable for financial damages in relation to the families of the 7 deceased girls. One of the lead petitioners, Amar Jasani, a physician who directs the Center for Studies in Ethics and Rights in Mumbai, told Professor Magoe that he regrets that he did not add the Gates Foundation as a defendant. The ethical guidelines of the Indian Council for Medical Research talks about totality of responsibility. It defines the totality of responsibility in terms of everybody. That means sponsor involved, Jasani said. Under that principle, everyone should be held responsible. There is also no evidence at the moment that the Gates Foundation took any steps to discipline PATH for the research it carried out in India. I think to some extent, the Gates Foundation thinks PATH has done nothing wrong, and that is a concern. One needs to get a spotlight on the Gates Foundation. The case is now before the country's Supreme Court. CDC cited Merck's and Gates's cheery assessments of the grotesque Indian experiments to help justify its expanded recommendation for the Gardasil vaccine. Prior to COVID-19, Gardasil was the most dangerous vaccine ever licensed, accounting for some 22% of cumulative injuries from all adverse events reported to the U.S. Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS. During clinical trials, Merck was unable to show that Gardasil was effective against cervical cancers. Instead, the studies showed the vaccine actually increases cervical cancer by 46.3% in women exposed to HPV prior to vaccination, perhaps 1/3 of all women. According to Merck's clinical trial reports, the vaccine was associated with autoimmune diseases in 1 out of every 39 women. Since introduction of that vaccine in 2006, thousands of girls have reported debilitating autoimmune diseases, and cancer rates have skyrocketed in young women. HPV vaccines and fertility. Gates's strong patronage of HPV vaccines, Gardasil and Cervarix, deepened suspicions that he was weaponizing vaccination.